Hi everyone, I'm V. Spehar with the James Beard Foundation. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Understanding the CARES Act, Paycheck Protection Program, EIDL loans, and more. We're very excited to have our friends at Arnold Porter back today. They did an incredible job last week with demystifying government programs. If you missed that, or the insurance one, or the unemployment one, you can find recordings of all our webinars at jamesbeard.org/industry-support-webinars. I also want to say, while our friends are professional lawyers, they are here on a pro bono basis. And what we really want to do is take the scary out of applying for these loans, understanding what they mean. So really treat this like a conversation you would have with a peer or a friend. It's not meant to be in lieu of an actual conversation with your lawyers or board members. It's just our best attempt to try and get to the clear point of the message and to tell you the parts of this program that directly affect the hospitality industry and try and clear some of the fog away from, all of the legal kind of mumbo jumbo that's out there and all of the changing updates that there have been. So again, disclaimer, treat this as a conversation with friends, not as an actual legal consult of the day. And make sure to listen back on this after you go through it today in case you have any more questions. I want to hand things over to Emily, who is going to talk a little bit about how you can interact with us during this webinar, because we want to make sure all your questions get answered and you feel very connected. So Emily, tell us how folks can participate.
Sorry, I was muted there. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're thrilled that you're here. We hope that we can help. So we are recording this webinar. We're going to send out a link to the recording after and also post it on that URL that Bea mentioned earlier, where you can find all of our past webinar recordings as well. We are going to save questions for the end, but we know that things are going to come up and we don't want you to forget them. So feel free to submit your questions as you have them. And we'll be feeding those through to Bea to make sure we can try to get those answered at the end of the webinar where we leave time for questions. If you're having technical difficulties, send me a message using either the chat or the question function. I can see both and I can help you out with that.
Great, thanks Emily. And our friends here have done such a good job that I know many of you submitted a question or emailed us before this webinar, and I had 2 full pages of questions. All of those were answered within their presentation. So can sole proprietors apply? What happens if I'm in default? All of that is going to be covered, so stay tuned all the way through to the end. With that said, I'd love to hand things over to our very first speaker, Jim Joseph, who you may remember from last week. Will be kicking it off with understanding what the programs are. So Jim, go ahead and tell us what we can expect to get into today.
Thanks, V. So today we're going to provide an overview of the stimulus packages that are available to small businesses, including loans, tax credits, and tax deferrals. One word of warning, guidance continues to come out of the SBA and Treasury. So our presentation is effective as of this morning, but some new guidance came out this morning and some came out late Thursday night. So you do need to keep checking back about some of this stuff as you go on because the government is building these programs in the air. So as we go along. There's also a high degree of likelihood that Congress is going to pass another stimulus package. Mitch McConnell said today that the Senate is already working on a stimulus package and they would like to get one done before Congress comes back or is planned to come back from recess on April 20th. Nancy Pelosi has not yet agreed to that schedule, but we do think that more money may be added to these programs, maybe with some changes. So again, just keep your ears open about things, in particular about the Paycheck Protection Program, which we'll talk about. And that's a good sort of lead in to the Pension Protection Program, the PPP. It's a loan program to help small businesses and charities to continue to pay workers and not lay them off and pay certain other set expenses so that the organizations, so that the entities don't have to shut down the loans can actually be forgiven under certain circumstances, and we'll go through that. So they effectively turn into a grant. Congress appropriated almost $350 billion to the PPP, but the money is given out on a first come, first served basis. So there has been some concern that this is going to run out, and we do expect it's going to run out. Some people will say the next couple of days, some people say next week. But if this is something you're thinking about, we do recommend that people start talking to their existing banks today about whether they're accepting PPP loan applications. Not all banks are or are eligible to do it, but you want to decide quickly to get in the door just in case money does run out. And now I'm going to turn it over to Arturo to tell us more about the PPP.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Yeah, so I'm going to spend some time talking about the eligibility requirements of the PPP loan program, which is the forgivable loan program that Jim just introduced, and then I'll talk a little bit about the some of the basic features of it before turning it back over to Jim. So in terms of eligibility, the PPP program is one that's administered by the Small Business Association. And so if you're a business that is eligible for small business 7A loans under their existing standards, and the SBA has published size standards. There's a size standards table that's available to the public, which has a revenue metric and an employee count metric for businesses in all different kinds of industries. And so if you fall within the definition of a small business under those size standards that are existing for 7A loans, you qualify for the PPP program. The CARES Act has expanded the eligibility criteria to allow other businesses that perhaps don't fit into this 7A loan eligibility requirements. And so if you're a business concern, a 501c3, a veterans organization under 501c19, or a tribal business concern, and you meet one of the following criteria, you're also eligible for a PPP loan. And then that is you have to have 500 or fewer employees. You meet one of the size standards that I referred to previously for 7A loans. Or if you're, and this is I think really important for businesses in the food industry, including restaurants, if you're in the 72 NAICS code, which will include restaurants and a variety of other businesses that are in the food industry, you can look at each of your locations and determine whether you're eligible based on whether you employ 500 or fewer people at each one of those locations. And that might not matter for a sort of a restaurant that's independent and where there's only a single location, but for restaurant groups that have multiple restaurants sort of across multiple locations, when you aggregate all of those, you might exceed the 500 employee requirement, but this rule allows you to just look at each individual location to determine whether you're eligible. And then the last group of businesses that are allowed to participate are sole proprietors, independent contractors, and other self-employed individuals.
So Arturo, I just have a quick question that's come in about that. And a lot of the questions that we've had were about sole proprietors. So folks like farmers, food trucks, people who own a small independent business, that they would qualify under this.
You absolutely, you would qualify and you can apply for a PPP loan for your business. Fantastic. All of them mentioned are eligible.
Great, thank you.
Maybe we can go on to the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have gotten a lot of questions from clients about, what do I have to demonstrate to the SBA in order to apply for one of these loans? Do I have to show that I am insolvent? Do I have to show that my revenues have fallen significantly? Do I have to show that I've exhausted my credit elsewhere? Those kinds of questions. And the answer in short is no, you don't have to show any of those things, really. There are a few certifications that you need to make. We've put on the slide the ones that we think are probably most interesting to describe. And the first one is a certification that you as a borrower have to make, which says that the current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary to support the ongoing operations of the applying business. And so again, it doesn't say, you know, you suffered significant revenue loss. It doesn't say that you don't have cash. It really just is intended to be sort of a soft certification that should not be very difficult to make. One of the other certifications that you need to make is that the funds will be used for the allowable purposes, and Jim will talk about what those are. And there is an important component to the forgiveness feature of this loan, which is that the funds that you use that will ultimately allow you to have the loan forgiven have to be used, at least 75% of them have to be used for payroll costs. So there are other costs that can go into the loan forgiveness calculation. And again, Jim will talk about that. But you can't have more than 25% of the loan proceeds used for those kinds of costs and still the forgiveness. And then the last thing that you need to certify that we think is just a good reminder is that, you know, all of the information that you prepare and you submit to your lender is true and accurate in all material respects. And there's a reminder in the application form that if you make false statements to obtain an SBA guaranteed loan, that is punishable by imprisonment or fines. And so we have always told our clients who have come to us that there are going to be some judgment calls in the way you calculate your payroll costs. And there are certain things that you know you might not necessarily be included in the law or in the regs that you would like to include, and it's not entirely clear whether you should or you shouldn't. If you're going to include them, we say make sure that you're absolutely transparent with your lenders about what you are including and what you're not including, so that nobody can come and say that you misled them later.
Right.
Okay. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how the loan amount is calculated. The way to think about this loan is that it is a loan that will provide you 2.5 months worth of your average monthly payroll costs. And so what you do in calculating the loan amount is you look back 12 months and you take your average monthly payroll costs during each of those, or your average monthly payroll costs during that period, and then you multiply that by 2.5. And that is your loan amount. And we're going to talk about what payroll costs are in a minute. There are a couple of exceptions. If, for example, you're a business that wasn't in operation last year between February 15th and June 30, you can, instead of going back 12 months, you can just use the first 2 months of this year to calculate your average payroll cost. So you'd use January and February of 2020. If you're a business that was in operation during the February 15th through June 30, 2019 period, but you haven't been in operation for 12 months and you just use the number of months that you have been in operation. So if it's 11 months or if it's 10 months, that is what you do. And then for seasonal businesses where you have seasonal employees, what you do is you look back at the time period between February 15th or March 1 at your election, and again June 30 of last year, and that is what you use to calculate your sort of average monthly. And again, you multiply that by 2.5, and that is the amount of your loan. You're going to hear a little bit about just very quickly about economic injury disaster loans. It's a separate loan program that the SBA has. You can apply for those as well. There are some limitations on applying for that and applying for a PPP. If you have already applied for one of these EIDL loans between January 31 and April 30, and you've actually obtained the loan, you are allowed to refinance that loan through a PPP loan.
Okay. That is great to hear.
Okay. And I think one last slide for me is this slide that relates to the payroll costs. We've gotten a lot of questions about what do you include in the calculation of payroll costs, what needs to be excluded, where are the judgment calls. The CARES Act contains a laundry list of items that are included in the definition of payroll costs. And so gross compensation, sort of the cash portion of compensation that you pay to your employees, is included in payroll costs. So that's salaries, wages, commissions, tips, and so on. And then there are also non-cash components of payroll costs: vacation, family leave, sick pay, contributions to group health care or insurance premiums, retirement benefits, state and local taxes that are assessed on an employee's comp. All of those things are included in the calculation of payroll costs. Now let's talk a little bit about the exclusions. The big one is cash compensation to any employee who makes more than $100,000 needs to be capped at $100,000 in your calculation. So it doesn't mean that you exclude those employees from your calculation. It just means that you only count the first $100,000 of their cash compensation. And then you still get to include these other non-cash items on top of that when you calculate, again, the payroll costs. The other thing that now has been made clear by the regulations is that payments that you make as a business to independent contractors or sole proprietors that provide you services are not included in your payroll costs. The employer's portion of FICA or payroll tax is also not included. And then if you take advantage of the tax credit that is provided to you under the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, that also needs to be excluded from your calculation of payroll costs. And then the last exclusion that I think is important is any employee whose principal place of residence is outside of the United States doesn't get included in your calculation of payroll costs. So that's sort of I think a fairly detailed description of what's in and what's out. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to Jim.
Well, Arturo or Jim, I have a couple questions that came in during that time, and thank you for this. That clarified about 70% of the questions were what's included, what's not included. So I'm glad that we were able to get to that. A few just that have popped up to double clarify. If you had employees and those employees have now opted to take unemployment, they are no longer a part of your potential payroll expense, right? Because they're taking unemployment, they're not employees, they don't get counted right now.
That's right.
Well, yeah, the loan amount though is you look back to last year.
Back. Okay. Perfect.
They will, when we get to the loan forgiveness, that's going to be very relevant.
Excellent. And then if but you can't include in this, like if I have a graphic designer that I hired to help with my website every so often, that doesn't count in my payroll, or that does?
That does not, because that's a classic independent contractor, and that what the regs have made clear is that independent contractor, your graphic designer, is eligible to go get a loan for him or herself. Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. Very helpful. And then the other thing is the health benefits or other things that they're paying that are listed here in the included. That is something that folks should be putting in and considering, which is helpful. And the only other thing is we've talked about who can apply. Can a 501c6 apply, or is there are other options for them?
501c6s cannot apply for a PPP. It's only 501c3s and these 501c19 veterans groups.
Excellent. Perfect. And then for all the other questions that folks are asking, if it has to do with insurance, tenant or retail rights, or unemployment or other government programs other than PPP or the disaster loan we're going to talk about, we have covered that last week, and there are recordings of those. how to deal with business interruption insurance, why it's not covered, how to negotiate with your landlord, tenant rights, all of that. So those questions won't be answered today, but we will send back out where you can find the information on those in particular. So thank you for that, guys. And over to Jim to continue with the PPP.
Okay, so as Arturo mentioned, that you can only use PPP loan proceeds for certain particular expenses. If you use them for anything else, then the government can come after you and try and collect that money back as soon as they find out you've spent it for something else. The primary cost that you can use your PPP for is payroll costs, as we defined on the prior page. So all of those things that we went through about what is included, those things you can pay using a PPP loan. You can also pay for rents, utility, mortgage payments, the interest on mortgage payments that you entered into before February 15th, 2020. You cannot use it to cover the principal payments of a mortgage, but interest you can cover. So for most businesses, the big expenses are going to be payroll, costs, and rent.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And so go ahead.
Nope. I was going to say the question on payroll that continues to come up is, and I think we answered a little bit earlier, if you have a W-2 on your business, you can include yourself, but if you were taking profits, you cannot include yourself.
Right. So if you are an owner of the business, but you also pay yourself W-2 income, and so you get a W-2, then you can include your income just like every other employee. But if you are just getting profits out of the business, then you cannot include those payments.
Excellent. And the payroll, the thing that Arturo was talking about, how to calculate your total, is based on your past, not based on what's happening right now today. So if you had a staff of 100 and now you only have 2, you're still calculating your loan based on what your employed staff was at that time and what you expect to be coming back to.
Correct. You look at what they were previously over the prior year based on sort of that monthly average, and then calculate the payroll cost, multiply it by 2.5.
And to double clarify once again, because I see 6 questions on this again, contractors may not be moved to your payroll. Those are independent businesses, people like marketers, designers, photographers. They are their own businesses who can apply for their own PPP. They cannot be included in your payroll as they are not part of your payroll.
Correct, because, and you can't do anything about it now because you have to do it based on sort of the 12 prior months. So
Right.
They really do lock you in from moving people around to try and inflate the amount of loan that you can get.
Excellent. And we understand that folks are really struggling right now and looking at this and saying,
Yeah.
There's no silver bullet to these programs, folks. And that's why we're trying to get the information on all the different places that you can find relief. And this one in particular, it is for payroll. It is for the folks who were on your payroll truly. And as much as we want it to be for all these other things and try to raise it, that's really going to get you in trouble. So for purposes of this, really treat this as what it can help you with. And then we'll continue to source resources for you on how you can do things like negotiate your rent, your utilities, other insurance claims that you can make. So keep in mind, this is for payroll only right now.
Right. And when we talk about the EIDL loan in a minute, that's much more flexible.
Perfect.
The terms of the PPP loan, and this has changed from the statute. The guidance that the government has put out changed what the statute said. So if you're hearing inconsistent things, this is what the rule is currently. It's a 2-year term and the interest rate is 1%. So it's a very low rate. And all lenders are required to defer payments on covered loans for 6 months. So if you apply for the loan today, you get it next week, you will not have to make a payment on the loan for 6 months. Interest will continue to accrue during that 6 months, but you won't have to pay it. You know, one question that you want to clarify with your lender is, do they require you to do anything to request the 6 months deferral? It seems like it should be automatic, but I know this is something lenders have also been questioning and trying to figure out. Now, this is where we get into math again. So the entire loan amount, including interest, can be forgiven under the PPP. And this is what makes it really a valuable program to a lot of small businesses. But there's a formula that you use to decide how much of the loan is forgiven. So if under that complicated formula that Arturo went through, if you can get a $250,000 loan, this then will tell you how much of that will be forgiven, and you will never have to pay back unless you misuse the proceeds of the money.
Right.
So you measure the expenditures that get included in this over an 8-week period, and the 8-week period is called the covered period. And the 8-week period, it starts on what's called the loan origination date. And I'll get back to that in a minute. So during this 8-week period, you look at, again, the payroll costs. So those same things that helped you calculate the loan in the first place. And then you also look at mortgage, rent, utilities, all of which, as long as they were things that you had signed up for before February 15th. And then on the payroll costs, and this is different again than it was in the original statute, at least 75% of your overall loan forgiveness has to be those payroll costs. And as B said, the name of this is the payroll, payroll or Paycheck Protection Program. It's designed to protect paychecks. So that they impose this obligation so that as you calculate the amount of your forgiveness, you do look at what your current payroll is for this 8-week period. And then if you have fewer employees now than you did in the 12 months before you applied for this loan, then your loan forgiveness can be reduced. Or if the salaries are are more than 25% reduced from what they were previously, it also reduces your forgiveness. So if you think of it, that the intent of this statute is that you continue to employ your people at the same wages that they were earning before. And so all of these benefits are designed to do that.
So I want to stop you there for 1 second just to be ultra clear on that point, which you articulated very well. If you're calculating your loan based on the employees that you had before and you're asking for $100, right? And that's whatever it takes. And you're paying out less than that now because you have less employees, less of that loan you took will be forgiven. So you want to keep that in mind when you're doing it. How much are you asking for and how much are you going to be able to use, because it won't just go away or magically be able to be used for something else. You'll have to be accountable to what you asked for and what it was intended to be, right?
Right. Yes, and this is a particularly difficult industry for this, difficult issue for this industry. Most of these restaurants are closed because the government has told them they have to be closed. And so you can't apply for a loan today, get the loan, and unless you're just keeping your employees on payroll, which is bordering on impossible, and also without tip income and everything else, many of your workers will be making more on unemployment. So you want to hurt them or even if they would come back to be employees. So it really has put restaurant owners in particular between a rock and a hard place. And this is something that all of you and the James Beard Foundation, other groups out there have been telling Congress and explaining to them and explaining to the SBA that runs this program, that the way it works just doesn't work for restaurants. Because you really will need, once you can open up, you'll need time to get your supply chain up and running. You'll then hire people again. So it could be 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks after the government says you can open again before you would really be operational. And who knows how many customers will be coming in given ongoing fears. So this is, I think, one of the biggest things that we need to look at and think about for the restaurant industry. And let's just go on to the next slide, because I know most of you have probably laid off your workers. And so the statute does allow you the right to rehire your workers, and then it doesn't hurt you in terms of the loan forgiveness. And the one thing that's still a little unclear is if you rehire a worker on June 30th, which is the deadline for rehiring under this provision, does that start a new 8-week period? Or is the 8-week period when you sort of, the loan origination date, we don't know if that's the day you applied for the loan, the day the government approved the loan, or the day you got your cash. And so
Yeah.
those four issues, I can't count. Those four issues are probably the biggest outstanding questions based on the statute as written for the restaurant industry. And then I think the next stage will be, convincing Congress and stimulus package 4 to fill in these gaps so that restaurants are able to more fully participate and get the benefits of this program.
Yeah, and we understand this is incredibly frustrating. And I know Ashley Kosiak from our advocacy team is auditing this call as well. Catherine Miller and that whole crew is working to fight, with the government and legislature to make these changes. Like we said, this isn't going to be a silver bullet for everyone, but we wanted to give as much information on this as possible. So if you have more questions, we'll probably be handling them in a follow-up if they're not answered in this presentation. But we'll keep going and see where we end up here.
Okay, so I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Hi. So I'm going to speak briefly about the EIDL loans, the economic injury disaster loans, which have been referenced a bit in the prior discussion. So the EIDL is a low interest federal loan typically available for borrowers experiencing economic injury, which here it's relevant obviously to all of you with the temporary loss of revenue due to the ongoing crisis or having to shut down or lay off workers or having supply chain interruption. It is required that the business has to have been operational as of January 31st, 2020. And the money it needs to be used to work off, as Jim mentioned, there's a bit more flexibility as to what the loan needs to be used for, and it needs to be used to pay off fixed debts, payroll, accounts payable, and other bills that could not have been paid off or had the the business is having trouble paying off due to the loss of revenue. It can't be used for expansion or any sort of, it's not to replace lost sales or profits. It's to use for ongoing debts. And the borrower may defer, as it says here, first repayment for 1 year after the origination debt, although interest will accrue during that time period. These EIDL loans are taking, I believe, approximately 30 days to come through. So in the meantime, there are these emergency grants. The applications are made directly through the SBA. And so there are these emergency grants that the SBA is instituting that are, they're able to process them within 3 days after receiving an application for an EIDL. And as this explains, the applicant must be eligible for an EIDL and again, be in operation since January 31st and use the grant for any allowable purpose, as I just discussed these purposes. And these grants do not need to be repaid. So they're, basically automatically forgiven, even if the applicant is actually eventually rejected for an EIDL. But if you're applying for an EIDL and a PPP, what happens is if you get this $10,000 emergency grant, that money is subtracted from your loan forgiveness amount. If you're also successful in obtaining a PPP and you calculate your loan forgiveness amount. So it's backed out of that amount. I think a couple other things that might be helpful to know is, the interest rate is 3.75% if you're for profit, and then for any of you on the line that may be nonprofits, it's 2.75%. So that's just kind of a quick overview of EIDL. And later on in the presentation, you'll see that we kind of do a side-by-side comparison of the PPP and EIDL. So you can see, you can kind of compare the eligibility requirements, the terms, and the amounts and things like that, and kind of compare them for yourselves of what might make the most sense for your business.
Great. Then I'm going to hold all the questions that we have right now, Rebecca, until we get to that comparison slide, because a lot of folks are asking, can I apply for both and whatever. So we'll hold it until then for those of you asking.
Sure. And you can apply for both.
Great. Anything else on the EIDL, or are we back to Jim or on to Charlie to finish us out now? There's Charlie.
Hello.
Hello.
I'd like to touch on a couple of provisions in the CARES Act that are not the protection, the payroll, Paycheck Protection Program and EIDL. These are not loans. In fact, these two provisions that I want to touch on this slide are provisions that employers can use only if they do not get a payment protection program loan, and at least for the deferral of the employer side of Social Security, do not get that loan forgiven. So this is an either or. You either are participating in the payment protection program, or if you are not eligible or do not get a loan, then you could take advantage of these two provisions. Having said that, these are provisions like the payment protection program, which are designed to incentivize employers to retain their employees. So to the extent you have already terminated employees, these are provisions that are not going to be terribly helpful, and the employees obviously can continue obtaining their benefits under the unemployment provisions. So again, these provisions are for employers who continue to employ their employees, whether or not they are providing services. The first one I want to touch on is the employee retention credit for employers. And the amount of this credit is 50% of qualified wages that are paid to each employee who is a covered employee for purposes of this rule. And qualified wages is basically, think of it as it's the payroll wages that you're paying to them up to a cap of $10,000, and therefore the credit is capped at $5,000 per employee who is covered under this rule. Now, the employers who are eligible to participate in this program are employees who've been financially impacted by COVID-19, and there are two different buckets under which an employer falls into the categories of being financially impacted by COVID-19. The first bucket is where there's a governmental order that causes the business to fully or partially suspend their business due to that order that limits their ability to travel or gather or otherwise impacts their business. The other bucket, so that's one bucket. The other bucket is for those businesses where even if there isn't an order that is COVID-19 related, but the gross receipts of the employer for a quarter during 2020 when compared to the similar quarter in 2019 has been reduced by at least 50%. So for example, if the gross receipts of the business in quarter 2 of 2020 is 50% or less than quarter 2 of 2019, then that employer will be eligible for this credit.
Okay.
The credit, as I said, it's for covered employees. Now, the employees as to which you get to take this credit depends on the size of the employer, measured by the number of average full-time employees that the business had in 2019. For those employers who had over 100 full-time employees, can take the credit with respect to each employee who is not providing services. So if you've terminated or furloughed, I should say, an employee, that employee is not providing services, as a result of the COVID-19 related financial impact, then the employer may take this credit up to $5,000 worth with respect to that employee. If the employer had 100 or fewer full-time employees on average during 2019, then that employer may take the credit with respect to each employee, whether or not that employee is providing services. So, obviously that would be, that's a better credit, provided you are still employing employees and they are providing services. And the way you get this credit is it's a credit against your payroll taxes that you would otherwise pay to the government. And you take the credit by simply not depositing the payroll taxes that you would have otherwise paid to the government. You just hold on to them. And then to the extent those payroll taxes aren't sufficient to cover the entire credit to which you're eligible to receive, the IRS will give you that money back as a refund. There's also a process where if you anticipate during a quarter that you will be entitled to the credit, but you do not think that you're going to have enough payroll taxes, you can file a form with the IRS and get an advance credit where the IRS will give you the cash during the quarter so that you can make these payments. And again, it's important to bear in mind that the credit is 50% of the qualified wages. So this isn't a dollar for dollar offset that the government is providing you like it would be providing you under the Payment Protection Act. You do have to shell out money for this if you are going to take advantage of it, and that's the cost that the company will bear in addition to what the government will reimburse you for.
Great, thank you, Charlie, for being so clear on that.
Yeah, so the other point I want to raise that might be helpful, again, if you continue to employ people, is the deferral of the employer share of Social Security tax. And any employer can take advantage of this other than those employers who have a payroll protection loan that is forgiven, which obviously is the point to the payroll protection program. But if you are eligible, you can defer the payment of the employer share of Social Security. That is the 6.2% up to the wage limit for 2020, which is, the wage limit is $137,000. So the amount of the Social Security that the employer can defer for the entire year would be $8,500. But obviously, we've already had a quarter where employers might have been paying some of their Social Security, so it's a little bit less. But if you are going to defer your employer share of Social Security, 50% of that deferred amount would be due on or before December 31, 2021, and the other 50% would be due on or before December 31, 2022. So those are two provisions that might be available to employers. A couple of other possible benefits that might be available to restaurant owners. These aren't specific to being employers or employees. This is just a cash amount that Congress has said it is going to pay to any individual, all individuals. So the payments that the government is providing for individuals is up to $1,200, and for joint filers, the payment is up to $2,400,000. That starts phasing out as the individual or joint filers have reported income of up to $75,000 for individuals and $150,000 for joint filers, and it phases out completely at $99,000 for individuals and $198,000 for joint filers. There's also additional credit of $500 per child, again, subject to those phase-outs. And right. This is available for U.S. individuals, not for non-resident aliens. Right. The last point I will make is that there are also provisions which loosen the rules that apply to retirement plans that will allow participants in retirement plans to take distributions that are related to COVID-19 reasons of up to $100,000. as well as the ability to take loans of up to $100,000 from retirement plans. And there are rules that allow you to, if you're going to take a distribution, for example, to either return that money to the plan without penalty, or if you wanted to just retain the money and not return it to the plan, there's a flattening out of the income inclusion over 3 years, so that you don't have an income inclusion of the entire amount all at once when you take the money out of the plan.
Good, very helpful. And I know that last week y'all clarified for us that the CARES Act programs, they are applicable to folks who hold a green card or have the working papers, are a legal working resident alien. It's just not applicable to folks who are undocumented fully. This just won't work for them. But if you're a green card holder or you do have a working visa and things like that, it will apply for you. Fantastic. So now we're going to compare. Thankfully, this was also one of the big questions. How do we know which one to choose? What makes the most sense? And if we applied for one, let's say some folks already applied for the PPP and they decide actually one of these other ones is better for them, can they refuse that money if it comes through?
Right, so we put together a comparison chart. Jim, if you want to run through this one.
Yeah, no, we can sort of do this together on this. So you can apply for both an EIDL and a Paycheck Protection program, which I think are the two big ones that are very useful. You know, the PPP has a 1% interest rate with a 2-year maturity. The EIDL has a 3.75, and I think it's a 30-year term for those, unless you refinance it into the PPP. And right. That's anything to add?
We lost the chart, I think.
Oh,
we need, Rebecca to keep sharing that screen.
Okay, well, while we
I don't know how that happened. Sorry about that.
So and as I mentioned just before, on the key elements comparing it, the employee retention credit is not available if you're going to get a payment protection program loan. There is no bar to getting the EIDL loan and participating in the employee retention credit, but the amount of the credit is up to $5,000. So less what those other loans can be, the max of those other loans. The payroll tax deferral is available to those employers who do not get their payment protection plan loan forgiven. But again, if you get an EIDL loan, you can take advantage of the payroll tax deferral. But the amount there is fairly limited. Again, the max is $8,500 around, although for those employers who have already paid Social Security, the employer share of Social Security, that amount is actually less.
Fantastic.
Should we go to the next slide?
So I think we went through the Paycheck Protection Program eligibility. Basically businesses with no more than 500 employees. And if you are a restaurant, as Arturo pointed out, a restaurant with multiple locations, a huge benefit that was included in the statute is you can look at each location and see if you have 500 or less employees. And
Jim, this is Rebecca. Actually, do you know if EIDL is the same per location?
So the EIDL doesn't have the more than 500 there's no 500 employee, or there is a 500 employee cap for the businesses. I don't know that it does actually, because that was specially included in PPP. So that's something we can clarify. Or Arturo, do you know?
Yeah. The per location eligibility provision is only applicable to the PPP loans. And the eligibility criteria for PPP loans and for the EIDL loans are slightly different And it's probably sort of beyond the scope of this discussion. So they are a little bit different, and that's one of the ways in which they're different.
And we'll be sending this deck out to folks so they can take a look at this and dig into it deeper as well. Want to continue on, Jim?
I think that's, I think we've gone over the other things on this side. So next, we've been through the math, sort of on
Great.
what sort of benefits are. And, I think that that's important to keep track of for the PPP, and you want to do the math not only for your maximum loan amount, but what you think your loan forgiveness amount would be, because obviously the economic impact of the PPP is significantly different if you have to pay back the loan in 2 years versus you get forgive it.
And so I want to be ultra clear about that again. Yes, if you are an owner who gets a W-2, you can calculate your wages into the PPP loan request. If you've never gotten a W-2, you cannot do that. You cannot include things like gym memberships, but you can include things like health benefits. You, whatever you're putting out there as your request based on your past history, the amount that is forgiven is going to be how much you use. So if you request $100,000 because that's what you were paying, or 10,000 or whatever, but you only are able to use half of that, you're still going to owe that other half back, and you may actually get yourself in a little bit of trouble for potentially misrepresenting your numbers as to what you need right now for paycheck protection. That money can only be used for paycheck protection. It really is a benefit for maintaining your employees where possible. So it may be a program that just doesn't work for you, or it may be a program where you're asking for a lot less than you thought you were, because the ramifications of asking for money, saying, well, it's based on my past payroll, and then not being able to prove that payroll and then spending it on rent, you're going to be a little bit screwed, and we don't want to do that. Another question that came through, and if you're not me or Jim, you might want to go on mute so that we lose a little bit of the background noise. The other question that came through, and I think it's a clever one, is do you have to rehire the same employees to get the forgiveness? Or if I had 10 employees and I'm hiring 10 back, but they're not the 10 same exact people, does that count?
They do not need to be the same people. So it's only based on head count, not the rest of the body.
Perfect. Head count, not social security number. And the other thing that we're seeing a lot of is folks are saying, well, how am I supposed to be able to do this when my employees will make more on unemployment? And the hard fact there is they will, in many cases, make more on unemployment. And that's something that you're going to have to factor into when you're trying to recover for the business and apply for loans for the business, that the payroll protection thing, it might not be something that you're able to do simply based on the fact that your employees are getting this extra stimulus, which comes from the government, which is made sort of generally so all folks go out and have some disposable income to dine at restaurants, to try and spend a little bit more, put a little bit more cash into the system. So it's a hard truth, but it's one that we're finding is probably likely. And you can again listen to the webinar that they did last week on demystifying government programs that spoke specifically to unemployment for your employees and for yourself. One more question on that. If you are a small business, let's say you're a seafood purveyor, let's say you're Sarah Ecolano, Well Class 2019, who wrote in this question, and you have a 1099 and you own your business, is it better for you to apply for unemployment, or is it better for you to try to apply for PPP because you probably do not have, the $75,000 or $100,000 payroll that you require to apply for PPP?
I mean, your PPP loan, you can apply no matter how sort of low it is. It's just going to be capped based on your payroll costs from the last year. It's the loan forgiveness that may be impacted, and you don't have to apply for the full amount. So if you had, the example, 100,000 in payroll costs last year, but now you only have 20,000, you could just apply for the 20,000, all of which you think would be forgiven. Which then makes it very valuable, because the one thing about unemployment that you need to remember is that is going to be taxable, and the PPP forgiveness is not taxable. And so that is another way that the PPP is more valuable if you can take it into account. But if you're trying to compare apples to apples in real dollar terms, remember you're going to have to pay taxes on the unemployment benefits, state
Right.
and federal.
Right. And to be just ultra clear one more time, if you own your business and you've never paid yourself on a W-2, you cannot start paying yourself on a W-2 and include it in your payroll protection request.
Not in your request. I mean, there might be a way that you could include it in your loan forgiveness because, you know, you don't have to hire the same employees back. So you could hire yourself instead of your old business manager, so that, you know.
So you can hire yourself now to be the general manager of your restaurant, but you cannot, if you didn't have a W-2 before and you're going to hire your old general manager back, you can't both be the general manager in a sense. Like you can start paying yourself, but you really, you want to be careful with that.
Yeah.
And you cannot, if you had 10 employees before and you were asking for $100,000 and now you're going to hire 10 people back, but you're going to hire 5 people back, but you're going to hire them and still spend $100,000, that doesn't work either because it's based on head count, not the cash that you paid them.
Correct. Right? And 75% of that 100,000 that you're calculating has to be in payroll cash, payroll costs. So if you paid 100,000 before, you're paying 75,000 now to the same number of employees, and then you have rent and other things that make up the other 25%. Then you still could get 100% of the loan forgiveness. You know, if, you know, and so it is some math that you have to sort of work through in figuring out what the forgiveness will be.
Perfect. And again, we hope that everyone goes through and reads more on these programs yourself, consult with your own lawyers, consult with your own accountants to see how best to do this most fairly and honestly. There are some folks who have questions about your net profits from the prior 12-month period going into the PPP. You can, what I'm hearing is you can maybe include all these things, but it might not get forgiven, which is the problem.
Right, and you can't include it in the, you know, in the loan amount that you can calculate.
Like eventually the truth's gonna come out. So you want to
be very clear. Right.
Yeah.
You do, as Arturo said, you want to be very clear on your loan application, and then in the loan forgiveness, you have to apply for that to the lender, and you have to provide documentation. So you would want you to show your, you know, if you use Paychecks or someone like that, or EDP, you'd have to show them a report from them about how much payroll you paid, or you would want to show your own employment tax returns, your 940 or 941, if you're doing it yourself. So they are going to ask for documentation. So you'd have to prove the payroll that you've been paying. They don't allow you to just sort of say, yeah, we paid it, trust us.
Right, of course. And maybe the best question we've got so far, how are we going to get this money, Jim? Let's say we apply, we get approved. Does it come direct deposit? Are they going to send me an oversized check? Like how is this money going to come to us, and about how long do we think it's truly going to take?
Well, I am assuming it's going to come by direct deposit. We are socially distancing. Let's hope they're not going to be sending checks. But asking each individual lender how long it is taking them to process these. A lot of lenders have been overwhelmed with applications. So I think we're going to have to see how long that takes. And the loan forgiveness, they say they're supposed to tell you within 60 days. I don't remember that there is a similar deadline in the upfront review of the loan.
Yeah, but we do encourage people, if this is something that sounds like it's going to work for you, do the research this week, today, when you get off this call, so you can get your application in this week, knowing that the initial round of funding that they put forth here will probably be exhausted, and you want to at least have your application in if it's something that makes sense for you now, as opposed to trying to wait until you maybe have all of the information just perfectly. There's still a lot of unknowns, even with regards to how long it could take to get that money. It does seem like it's something that should be a priority this week, which is why we were lucky enough to be able to do this pop-up seminar today.
And one other thing on that, I think there was a question before, like, could you turn this down?
Yes.
And so that's, again, with the EIDL, it seems clear that, if you apply and then decide you don't want it, you should be able to, but you should ask your lender too, where in the process can you pull the plug if you decide as you get more information that, one or both of these loan programs don't make sense.
Yes. And unfortunately, for some folks who have asked, if you had an SBA loan and that loan is now in default or is not in good standing because of coronavirus or because you had to shut down, Jim, how likely is it that they'll be approved for a PPP loan, or will an SBA default automatically cancel out?
Yeah, the rules do say that it cancels it out, that you cannot apply if you have already defaulted, and I think if you've defaulted within the last 7 years.
Okay.
It doesn't have to just be COVID related. It's over the last 7 years.
Good to know. I think that we have covered just about everything else. For folks who had questions about insurance claims, retail, unemployment, stuff like that, please go back to jamesbeard.org/industry-support-webinars, and we'll send it out with a recording of this as well. It's the same place you went to sign up to come to this webinar. They're all recorded there, and they're all just as efficient at disseminating the information as we can possibly be. There's a lot of information in there about tenant rights. There's a lot in there about unemployment for yourself, for your employees, what the subsidies look like. And I think that generally answers all of our questions. Jim, did you have any final points on applying for PPP, or thoughts on how you see this maybe potentially changing over the next couple of weeks?
I would contact your lender where you have your banking relationship as a first step to see if they are actually making these loans. And if not, then you might have to look for others. Most banks are only doing these for their existing customers. Right. So that's your first step. And based on the popularity of these programs, based on the push from, it seems, all sides of the political spectrum, my bet would be that Congress is going to put more money into these programs, but who knows with Washington what they're going to do. But I think we should, at the latest, the end of April, we would know, but it could be as soon as the next couple of days that we'll know whether they're going to plan on doing that.
Fantastic. And final question, Jim. You still can only spend the 75% on payroll expenses, right? So
exactly.
You cannot change that. That's the way that it's written out. So even if you obtained a loan for more and you get the money, you spend what you can on payroll, the rest is not eligible for forgiveness, you still cannot spend it on anything other than payroll. You will have to be held accountable to that. That's where you could potentially get yourself in trouble with asking for more and not being able to use it on payroll. So please be extremely careful when y'all are applying for this. Check with your accountants and lawyers. Make sure that you've got it lined up so that it's accurate, and you'll be able to report back on it. They're going to be looking at these. So we want to be really, really careful with what we're doing and making sure that we're using the right loan for the right things. And there are a lot of other programs out there, many of which we're reviewing on our webinars. You can go to jamesbeard.org/relief. And I think Emily can pull up that slide with the info on our sites. jamesbeard.org/relief talks about our fund, talks about updates that are happening in advocacy, what's going on the Hill, what new programs are coming out, everything that we're learning as it results to how to put cash back in your businesses. We are trying to get right back out to you as soon as possible. Sign up for our newsletters. I want to thank you, Jim, and the rest of the team at Arnold Porter for helping us again today navigate this incredible system that folks have put together that we could have never, ever got through without you, especially the calculations. Like, big high fives to Arturo for breaking down those calculations. I know that, chefs and restaurants understand recipes, but we all still need them written down, right? We don't want to wing it on any of this. So I appreciate you all so much. I'm so sure we'll be hearing more from you in the coming weeks. For anybody who still has questions on this exact topic, we have another organization, Arturo, who is coming in next week on April 14th at 2 p.m. to do cash management and the loans and how to balance your cash management with what loans you may be getting or are approved for. So check out 414 up Hero. That's going to be a great seminar. And then, of course, join us on Fridays when we raise a quarantini with our friends in the beverage environment to try and just take the edge off before the rest of the week. If we can do anything else for you, you can email us at impact@jamesbeard.org. I want to say thank you again, Jim. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today, and we'll see you all tomorrow at 2. Thank you.